When Damon proposed to me, I thought everything in my life had finally fallen into place. We had been together for 4 years, building a quiet life in New York City that felt safe and full of possibilities. He had always been steady, thoughtful, and kind. Our relationship wasn't the kind that people wrote about in dramatic novels, but it was honest, built on small moments and steady growth. We met at a business conference. I was working in corporate marketing, and he was already making a name for himself in finance. He wasn't the flashiest person in the room, but his calm confidence drew me in. Our conversations were easy from the start, and before long, casual dinners turned into weekends together, and weekends together turned into something much more serious. After 4 years, Damon took me away for a quiet weekend trip in Vermont. There was no grand spectacle, no audience, just the two of us by the lake, wrapped in coats, watching the autumn leaves fall. He pulled out the ring with a simple question. I didn't need to think. I said yes before he even finished asking. It felt natural to share the news with my family right away. My parents had always liked Damon, and I believed my younger sister, Brielle, would be thrilled. She and I had grown up close. At least, that's what I thought back then. We had our differences, but I never believed those differences ran deep. When we arrived at the family estate in Charleston to share the news, my mother hugged me tightly. My father shook Damon's hand with approval. But Brielle's reaction was a little different. She smiled, but something about the way her eyes briefly shifted gave me pause. Well, she said, her voice light, you certainly beat me to it. I laughed, brushing it off. Brielle was always competitive in small ways. Grades, attention, even boyfriends when we were younger. But we were adults now. I believed those little rivalries had faded. As wedding plans began, I quickly realized Brielle wanted to be involved in everything. She offered to help pick the venue, the dress, the guest list, even the floral arrangements. At first, I appreciated her enthusiasm. Planning a wedding was overwhelming, and having my sister by my side felt like support. But small things started happening. She would make offhand comments about my choices. Are you sure that dress flatters your figure? She asked during one fitting, her tone almost concerned. Maybe something more structured would be better. At the cake tasting, she suggested, Damon seems to prefer the vanilla one. You want him to enjoy the cake too, right? Little nudges, small suggestions. I didn't see them for what they were in the beginning. I told myself she was trying to help, that she cared. Damon didn't notice anything unusual. He always treated Brielle kindly, answering her questions politely, laughing at her jokes. She was my sister, after all. There was no reason to suspect anything more. As the months passed, Brielle's involvement grew heavier. She began calling Damon directly to discuss small wedding details without telling me. I found out only when he casually mentioned conversations I hadn't been part of. At first, I thought maybe I was overreacting. Damon was busy with work, and Brielle had more free time. Maybe she was just trying to take some pressure off me. But my instincts began to twinge. Then came the night that left me unsettled. We were at a family dinner. My parents had invited some friends, and Brielle arrived wearing a dress strikingly similar to one I had tried on weeks earlier but ultimately rejected. She stood close to Damon most of the evening, laughing, touching his arm lightly during conversations. It was subtle, but I saw it. After dinner, as I was helping my mother clear plates, I overheard a brief exchange between Brielle and one of my father's colleagues. Are you sure you're not the one marrying him? The older gentleman joked. Brielle laughed. Sometimes I wonder, she replied playfully. It stung. But again, I said nothing. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I didn't want to start conflict where none existed. As the wedding date approached, Damon's job required him to take an extended business trip overseas. It wasn't ideal timing, but we agreed that it was an important opportunity for his career. He reassured me constantly through our calls that everything would be fine, that we would pick up right where we left off when he returned. During those weeks apart, Brielle visited me often. She always came with coffee or takeout, acting like she was simply keeping me company. But her conversation subtly shifted. "I know you trust him," she said one evening while we sat in my apartment, sipping tea. "But men change when they're away for that long. You hear stories all the time." I frowned. "Damon's not like that." "Of course," she said quickly. "I'm sure you're right. But it never hurts to be careful. People can surprise you." Her words lingered long after she left. When Damon returned, something was off. He was polite but distant. Our conversations felt stilted. When I'd asked if everything was all right, he brushed it off as jet lag and stress. Then, 2 weeks later, he sat me down. "I don't know if we should go through with the wedding, Serafina," he said gently. "I've been hearing things, and I need time to think." My chest tightened. "Hearing things? From who?" He hesitated. "It doesn't matter. I need space." He didn't say Brielle's name, but I didn't have to hear it. I was devastated. The wedding was postponed indefinitely. My family offered quiet comfort, but Brielle's sympathy felt almost performative. "I'm so sorry, sis," she said, hugging me. "Maybe it just wasn't meant to be." I tried to heal. I tried to focus on work, on my friends, on moving forward. But the pain lingered, and Brielle's presence became harder to bear. She began mentioning Damon casually, as if they were simply friends who happened to run into each other often. 6 months later, the final blow came. My parents called me to share that Brielle and Damon were engaged. I couldn't breathe for a moment. I hung up the phone and sat in silence. The betrayal was complete. My sister, who had once stood beside me as family, was now preparing to marry the man I had loved and nearly married myself. But I didn't confront her. I didn't beg Damon for answers. I chose silence. Instead, I withdrew quietly and began focusing on myself. I moved forward, slowly building my career again, restoring my peace little by little. What I didn't know then was that everything Brielle had so carefully constructed was about to unravel in the most unexpected way, and it wouldn't come from me. The months leading up to Brielle's wedding were strangely quiet. My parents were careful with their words, tiptoeing around the obvious tension. Friends reached out with hesitant kindness, unsure of what to say. I stayed distant, polite when necessary, but made no effort to involve myself. I wasn't invited to help with the planning. That wasn't surprising. But one day, a formal invitation arrived in my mailbox. My name, printed neatly in gold script, underlined with delicate floral patterns, an invitation to attend the wedding as a guest. I sat with that envelope for a long time. Part of me considered not going. What was the point of watching my sister marry the man who had once promised forever to me? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that staying away would feel like surrendering a piece of myself. I had nothing to hide. I had done nothing wrong. If anything, my presence would be my quiet way of showing that I had survived what they had done. I RSVP'd yes. The wedding was set to take place at the Vale family estate in Charleston, the same place where I had once imagined my own wedding would be held. The house stood like a symbol of everything my family had built, with its grand columns, sprawling gardens, and manicured lawns. Growing up there had always felt like living inside a perfectly maintained picture frame. When the day arrived, the sky was clear, the air warm but not heavy. Everything looked beautiful, as I knew it would. Brielle had spared no expense. The driveway was lined with white roses, and the entrance was decorated with ivory drapes that billowed softly in the breeze. I wore a simple, elegant dress, nothing flashy, but respectful. I wasn't there to make a statement. I was there to witness, to stand quietly as the truth unfolded around me. The ceremony was to be held in the grand ballroom. Gold chandeliers sparkled above rows of carefully arranged chairs. White and blush roses filled every corner. A live quartet played softly as guests took their seats. As I entered the room, a few people glanced my way. Some offered polite nods. Others quickly turned back to their conversations. I saw my mother across the room, her expression soft but unreadable. My father stood beside her, hands clasped behind his back. And then there was Brielle. She stood at the far side of the room, surrounded by bridesmaids, her dress flowing around her like a cloud. She looked radiant, exactly as she had always dreamed. Her eyes caught mine for a brief second. She smiled, small and tight, as if reminding me that she had won. But I didn't smile back. Instead, I found my seat near the middle row and sat quietly, hands folded in my lap. The guests continued arriving, filling the room with the soft hum of conversation. Servers moved discreetly, offering champagne and small hors d'oeuvres. Then I noticed a man walking toward the front of the room, carrying a folder tucked neatly under his arm. I recognized him from brief family mentions, Callum Hart, the wedding planner. He moved with a purpose, exchanging a few quiet words with the officiant before glancing toward where Damon stood, waiting near the altar. I watched Damon carefully. His face was calm, but his eyes carried a slight tension. It was subtle, but it was there, as if something wasn't sitting quite right with him. The ceremony was moments from beginning when Callum stepped forward once more. This time, he held a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began politely, his voice clear but composed. "Before we proceed, there's a matter of legal importance that requires attention." The room grew still. Whispered conversations halted. All eyes turned toward him. Brielle's smile faltered, her head tilting slightly in confusion. Damon shifted where he stood, glancing toward Callum. In the process of finalizing the marriage license for today's ceremony, some prior records were uncovered. Callum continued, his voice steady. "It appears that Damon Caraway is already legally married." A ripple moved through the guests like a quiet gasp. Brielle's expression froze completely. Damon's face drained of color. My own heart beat steady in my chest. "There is an official marriage certificate on file," Callum said, carefully opening the folder. "Dated and processed during Mr. Caraway's time overseas last year." He paused for just a moment, letting the weight of his words settle. "The legal spouse listed on that certificate," he concluded, "is Serafina Vale." Gasps filled the room now, louder, more frantic. The elegant order of the day unraveled instantly. Brielle's eyes darted to me, wide and panicked. For a long moment, no one moved. I remained seated, calm, composed. I didn't need to say a word. The truth had spoken for itself. Damon turned to Brielle, his expression filled with something between shock and realization. His voice was low, but the microphone near him carried his words clearly. "You told me it wasn't finalized." Brielle's mouth opened, but nothing came out. "You knew," Damon said, his voice trembling slightly now. "You knew all along." The room fell silent again, heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded. The officiant stepped back quietly. Callum closed the folder and gently handed it to the attorney, standing nearby. Without ceremony, the wedding was canceled. Guests whispered among themselves as some began quietly leaving the room. The once beautiful celebration dissolved into awkward glances and broken conversations. I rose from my seat calmly. My parents remained frozen where they stood. My mother's hand lightly covered her mouth, while my father stared ahead, expressionless. As I made my way toward the exit, Damon moved quickly to follow. "Serafina, please," he said softly, reaching for my arm. I didn't know. I stopped and looked at him. His eyes were filled with desperation and regret. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he said. "She told me everything was settled, that you had walked away." I held his gaze for a moment, my voice steady. "You had doubts, but you didn't ask me." He closed his eyes briefly, guilt settling across his face. "You trusted her lies more than you trusted my truth," I said, not in anger, but in honesty. He opened his mouth as if to speak again, but I gently shook my head. "Not now." And with that, I walked away. I didn't leave with anger that day. I left with something far more valuable, my peace. The days following the wedding were oddly quiet. There were no long, dramatic confrontations, no heated arguments, just a deep, heavy silence from almost everyone involved. I stayed in Charleston for a few extra days, not because I had any obligations, but because I needed a little more time to fully process everything. My phone remained mostly silent. A few distant relatives sent awkward messages, mostly empty words of support, as if they didn't quite know which side to stand on. My parents didn't call, and Brielle, she didn't reach out at all. But Damon did. The day after the failed wedding, he left several voicemails. Each one sounded more desperate than the last. His words were filled with apologies, explanations, pleas for understanding. I listened to every one of them quietly, sitting by the window in my hotel room, staring at the oak trees swaying gently in the courtyard below. He wasn't a bad person. That's what made the entire situation more complicated. But he had allowed himself to be pulled in by my sister's manipulations, even when his instincts must have told him something was wrong. That hurt far more than any outright betrayal would have. I didn't respond right away. I needed to be sure of what I wanted before I said anything. A few days later, Damon requested to meet. I agreed, but only after careful thought. We met at a small cafe just outside the city, somewhere quiet, neutral, far from the noise of the estate or the memory of the wedding hall. He was already seated when I arrived. He stood quickly when he saw me, his eyes searching my face. "Thank you for coming," he said softly. I nodded and took a seat across from him. The server came by, but neither of us ordered anything. For a while, we sat in silence. Finally, he spoke. "I know you probably don't want to hear any more from me," he began, his voice steady but weighted. "But I need you to know that I see everything now. Everything she did. Everything I allowed to happen." I listened quietly, letting him continue. "I should have questioned it all sooner," he said. "The stories she told me, the doubts she planted. I let her create distance between us, and I never came to you directly. I was weak." He paused, glancing down at his hands resting on the table. "You trusted me," he said softly, "and I failed you." His words were honest. There was no defensiveness, no excuses. I finally spoke. "You let someone else rewrite our story," I said calmly. "You let my sister step into a place that was never hers to take." "I know," he whispered. I took a slow breath. "I'm not angry, Damon," I continued. "I was. But now I'm just tired." He looked up, his eyes pleading. "I still love you, Serafina," but words hung between us like a fragile thread. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he added quickly. "But if there's any chance at all that we could try again, I would do whatever it takes." His voice broke slightly, not because of guilt, but because I know what I almost destroyed. I looked at him carefully. The man sitting across from me wasn't the same man who had doubted me months ago. There was humility in him now, a kind of quiet vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "I don't know if I can trust you the way I once did," I admitted. "Not yet." He nodded slowly. "I understand. I need time," I said gently. "And if you truly want to rebuild anything, it can't be rushed. It has to come from a place that's completely honest." "I'll wait," he said immediately, "as long as it takes." We sat there quietly for a few more minutes, both of us unsure how to end a conversation like that. Finally, I stood, and he stood with me. "Take care of yourself, Damon," I said softly. "You too," he replied. As I walked away, I didn't feel closure, but I felt clarity. Later that week, Brielle— "I don't hate you, Brielle," I said gently. "But you need to figure out why you needed to take something that was never yours. Until you do, you'll never be happy." There was silence on the other end before she finally said, "I'm sorry." I didn't say the words back. Not because I wanted to hold on to the pain, but because forgiveness wasn't something that could be forced in a single conversation. It would take time, if it ever came at all. After the call ended, I felt a weight lift slightly from my chest. I had carried so much pain quietly for so long. Now, at least, the truth was in the open. The weeks that followed were filled with small steps. Damon respected my space, only reaching out occasionally to check in, always gently, never pushing. My parents, too, seemed more tentative around me, careful not to stir wounds they barely understood. but I was finding my footing again, piece by piece. I didn't know yet where it would all lead, but I knew I was finally walking forward on my own terms, and that was enough. As the weeks turned into months, something shifted in me. The initial pain had softened into something else. Not quite forgiveness, but acceptance. I no longer carried the sharp edge of betrayal with me everywhere I went. Instead, I was learning to simply live again. Work became my anchor. My job in New York had always been steady, but now I poured myself into it with quiet focus. New projects, new clients, and a small but growing team that believed in what we were building. It felt good to create something that belonged entirely to me, untouched by family dynamics or complicated relationships. In the middle of all this, Damon remained present, but distant enough to respect my space. He would occasionally send a kind message or an update about his own work. Never too much, never pressuring me. It was as if he understood that anything between us now needed to unfold at my pace. I appreciated his restraint more than he probably knew. One afternoon, after a particularly long meeting, I found a small package waiting for me at my apartment door. There was no note. Just a simple white box, tied with a pale ribbon. Inside was a hardcover book. A first edition of one of my favorite novels. Something I had mentioned in passing years ago when Damon and I had been walking through a bookstore together. I smiled softly. He remembered. It wasn't grand gestures or apologies that mattered to me anymore. It was moments like this. Quiet, thoughtful, genuine. I placed the book on my coffee table and left it at that. A few weeks later, we finally met again in person, not by accident. I had agreed to it after much thought. We met at a small park near the river, far from the noise of downtown. The air was cool, and the leaves were starting to turn, hinting at the early signs of fall. The simplicity of the setting made it easier to breathe. Damon was already sitting on one of the benches when I arrived. When he saw me, he stood up, his expression a mixture of nervousness and hope. "Hi," he said softly. "Hi," I replied. We sat down together, leaving a small space between us. Not out of discomfort, but out of caution. For a while we talked about simple things. Work, mutual friends, the changing seasons. It was light, careful, but not forced. Eventually the conversation shifted. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about everything," Damon said quietly. "Not just what happened, but why I allowed it to happen." I listened, not interrupting. "I was so caught up in trying to please everyone," he continued. "Your family, your sister, even my own insecurities. I let doubt cloud what I already knew about you, about us." He turned slightly to face me more fully. "You were always honest with me, and I should have trusted that." I held his gaze, hearing the weight behind his words. "I can't change what I did," he said, "but I can promise you that I've learned from it." I nodded slowly. "I know you have." He exhaled softly, as if releasing something he had carried for too long. "I don't expect things to go back to how they were," he said, "but if there's any chance at all to build something new together, I'm here." His voice was steady. There was no desperation, just quiet sincerity. I took a breath before responding. "I'm not the same person I was before," I said gently, "and you're not either." He nodded. "That's true." "If we move forward," I continued, "it has to be as two people who have both grown, not as people trying to recreate the past." "That's all I want," he said softly. We sat there in silence again, letting the moment settle between us. It wasn't an easy decision, and it wasn't final. But it was a beginning I hadn't expected to reach. Over the following months, we took things slowly. Dinners, walks, long conversations. We talked about things we had never fully addressed before. Our fears, our mistakes, our hopes. For the first time, we were building something not on assumptions or expectations, but on full honesty. My family remained mostly silent during this time. My parents, who had once tiptoed around the subject, eventually accepted the distance I had created from them. They didn't question my choices, perhaps realizing they no longer had the same hold over me. As for Brielle, I hadn't spoken to her again since our last phone call. She stayed quiet, living her life in the background. I didn't hold anger toward her anymore. I simply no longer allowed her to occupy space in my life. I was reclaiming peace, not by forcing reconciliation, but by choosing where to place my energy. One evening, as Damon and I sat on my apartment balcony watching the city lights shimmer, he reached for my hand. "You've always been stronger than me," he said softly. I smiled. Not stronger, just different. He looked at me, his expression full of something new. Not infatuation, not guilt, but respect. "This time," he said, "I won't take that for granted." The air was still, calm, and for the first time in a long time, I felt entirely present. I didn't know where the future would take us, but I knew whatever came next would be built on something real. And that, finally, was enough. As time passed, something unexpected happened between Damon and me. The heaviness that once sat between us began to dissolve, not because we pretended the past hadn't happened, but because we faced it openly. There was no rushing, no urgent declarations, just simple, steady days filled with quiet understanding. We started spending more weekends together, often doing the smallest things: cooking dinner, walking through old bookstores, or sitting in the park watching people pass by. Those small moments held more meaning than any grand romantic gestures ever could. One Saturday afternoon, we visited a small farmer's market near the city. The air smelled of fresh bread and roasted coffee. I watched Damon as he talked to one of the vendors about homemade jams. His face relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. It was in these little scenes that I saw who we were now. Two people learning to simply enjoy each other's company again. After we got back to my apartment that evening, Damon surprised me with a question. "Would you like to go back to Charleston for a few days?" he asked gently. I paused. I hadn't returned since Brielle's wedding. "Why?" I asked softly. "Closure, maybe," he said. "For both of us. I thought we could visit your parents. Nothing complicated, just a visit." I thought about it. The idea of returning made my chest tighten a little. But part of me knew it was time. A few weeks later, we made the trip. The moment I stepped onto the familiar grounds of the family estate, a quiet rush of memories surfaced. The grand columns, the perfectly trimmed hedges, the sound of gravel underfoot. It was all the same. But I was not. My parents greeted us at the door. My mother's face carried a mixture of surprise and relief. My father, always more reserved, offered a polite but genuine welcome. Over dinner, the conversation was civil. Damon answered their questions thoughtfully. I spoke with quiet confidence. There was no tension, but also no pretending that everything had been easy. It was simply a meal shared by people who understood that the past couldn't be erased, but could be acknowledged. At one point, my mother placed her hand gently on mine. "I've missed having you here," she said softly. I smiled, holding her gaze. "I've missed being here, too, but I needed the time." She nodded, understanding. After dinner, Damon and I took a short walk through the garden. The evening air was cool, and the soft glow from the house lights bathed the path ahead. "You handled that gracefully," Damon said quietly. "I've had practice," I replied with a small smile. He stopped walking and turned toward me. "I'm proud of you, Serafina," he said, "not just for forgiving me, but for everything you've built, for how you've grown." I looked at him, seeing not the man who had once hurt me, but the man who had chosen to face his mistakes fully. "I'm proud of you too," I said. He reached for my hand, and for a moment we stood there in silence, surrounded by the quiet rustling of leaves. When we returned to New York, something between us felt even more settled. The visit had closed a chapter, not by rewriting it, but by allowing it to finally rest. A few months later, Damon brought up something I hadn't fully expected. "I want to marry you," he said softly one evening as we sat in the living room. I looked at him, my heart steady. "But not because we need to fix the past," he continued. "Because I want to build something entirely new. With you." We didn't rush into plans. There was no urgency to prove anything to anyone. We chose a small, simple ceremony. Just close friends and a few family members who had stood by us through everything. Brielle wasn't there. That was a decision I made quietly, without bitterness. Some bridges don't need to be rebuilt, and that was one of them. On the day of our wedding, as I stood across from Damon, I didn't feel like I was reclaiming something lost. I felt like I was choosing something entirely new. Our vows were honest, simple, full of quiet promises built on everything we had learned, not just about love, but about ourselves. When we exchanged rings, Damon whispered softly, "Thank you for giving us this chance." I smiled. "Thank you for earning it." As we walked out together, hand in hand, surrounded by people who truly supported us, I finally felt what I had hoped for all along. Not victory, not vindication, just peace. In the months that followed our wedding, life settled into something simple, something calm. There were no sharp turns, no unexpected waves, just quiet days filled with steady rhythms. For the first time in a very long while, my world didn't feel like it was balancing on fragile ground. Damon and I moved into a modest brownstone, not far from the park where we had restarted everything. The kind of home where the rooms were filled more with light than with things. We chose it together, not because it impressed anyone, but because it fit who we were now. Sometimes, late at night, we would sit on the balcony, sipping tea, watching the lights flicker across the skyline. We didn't speak about the past much, not because it was forbidden, but because it no longer held power over us. When we did speak of it, it was soft, honest, almost like observing the story of other people we once were. One evening, Damon said something that stayed with me. "You know," he began, "there was a time when I thought love was supposed to feel perfect, effortless, like the right person would make everything easy." He looked at me, his eyes warm. "But I learned that real love isn't about ease. It's about staying when things aren't simple. It's about choosing each other again, even when it would have been easier to give up." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "That's why we're here now," I said, "because we didn't pretend it was easy." He smiled. "And because you were willing to let me earn my place beside you again." It wasn't about starting over. It was about starting new. Around us, the world kept moving forward. My career grew steadily, but I no longer threw myself into work as a way to fill the spaces inside me. The emptiness that once lived there had faded. In its place was something far more steady, a quiet confidence that didn't need to be seen by anyone but myself. My parents visited us sometimes. Their visits were lighter now, more relaxed. They had come to accept the life I had built, even if it wasn't the path they had originally imagined. My mother would often sit in the kitchen with me, drinking tea, asking about my work, Damon, and life in the city. And though we never spoke about Brielle directly, there was an unspoken understanding between us that some parts of the past had been gently placed down, not erased, but no longer carried daily. As for Brielle herself, I hadn't seen her since that final phone call. Occasionally, I would hear bits of news through relatives, updates about where she was living or the work she was doing, but I felt no pull toward reconnecting. Letting go doesn't always mean forgetting. Sometimes it simply means choosing where your peace belongs. One spring afternoon, Damon and I took a walk through the park where we had first begun rebuilding everything. The cherry blossoms were blooming, their soft petals floating gently in the breeze. We found a bench beneath one of the larger trees and sat down, quietly taking in the scene. "You ever think about how far we've come?" Damon asked softly. I smiled. "Sometimes." He turned to face me, his voice steady but full of quiet emotion. "I'll never stop being grateful that you gave us another chance. And I'll never stop being grateful that you worked for it," I said gently. We sat there in silence for a while, not needing words to fill the space between us. In that moment, I understood something very clearly. The hardest part was never surviving the betrayal. The hardest part was finding the courage to open my heart again, to trust, to rebuild, and to let love grow, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. And